I'm going to tell you about something that happened at Fort Greely, Alaska, in the middle of the 1970s. This story comes from a man named Robert Edmond. He's in his 80s now, living quietly in Fairbanks, and for close to 50 years, he didn't talk about what happened during his service. Not to his wife, not to his kids, not even to other veterans who might have understood the kind of thing you carry home when you're stationed somewhere remote and far enough north that the normal rules stop applying. I met him through a mutual contact, someone who knew he'd finally decided to break the silence. The only condition he had was that I use his real name. Not pseudonym, not anonymity. He said if he was going to tell it, it needed to be on the record, full accountability. Edmond's a precise man. He keeps detailed records of everything. When he talks, he doesn't embellish. He gives you dates, times, weather conditions, the names of people involved, the exact layout of terrain. It's the speech pattern of someone trained in military protocols, someone who understands that accuracy matters when you're describing something that institutions wanted to keep buried. Throughout our conversations, he referred to handwritten notes from 1975, field journals that he'd maintained through decades of storage in a locked cabinet in his Fairbanks home. He brought those journals out when we spoke. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting faded but legible, the entries precise and methodical. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. Fort Greely sits about 85 miles south of Fairbanks in interior Alaska. In the 1970s, it represented a significant military installation, a strategic position in the heart of the territory that had become defined by Cold War geopolitical calculations. The post was established in 1942 as a training facility. By the time Edmond arrived in 1974, it had evolved into a complex military operation with research components, training programs, logistics operations, and specialized units focused on reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. The base wasn't as large as major installations in the lower 48, but it was significant enough to warrant substantial investment and specialized personnel. The climate at Fort Greely is unforgiving. Interior Alaska in winter means darkness for months, temperatures that regularly drop to 40, 50, 60 degrees below zero. Summer brings mosquitoes the size of small birds and daylight that never fully ends. The landscape is boreal forest, spruce and birch, with permafrost beneath the soil that makes construction and infrastructure perpetually challenging. It's the kind of place where the normal rules of temperate existence don't apply. Vegetation patterns are different. Animal behavior is different. Time itself feels different when you're that far north, when the sun disappears entirely for weeks, or doesn't set at all, depending on the season. Edmond arrived in 1974 as part of a special operations team. He'd been recruited out of the Army's Tracking and Reconnaissance Unit based on experience he had surveying remote terrain in the Pacific Northwest. For the previous 8 years, he'd been working in wilderness assessment operations, places where no one else wanted to go, mapping terrain that barely appeared on official maps. He was good at what he did. He could read landscapes the way most people read books. He could track movements through dense forest. He could establish camps in hostile territory and maintain them for months without resupply. He was exactly the kind of person the military needed for something they wouldn't talk about. His orders were deliberately vague, the kind of military language designed to communicate without actually stating the mission. Reconnaissance, they said. Long-range surveillance in the interior, wildlife monitoring and movement tracking, ecological assessment. He was told to report to Fort Greely, to undergo a security briefing, and to expect that his movements would be restricted for the duration of his assignment. He was given a security clearance upgrade that afternoon, processed through a system that seemed designed to exist outside normal military bureaucracy. Questions were discouraged. Answers were compartmentalized. It wasn't until he got there that he understood what that actually meant. And even then, full understanding didn't come until the initial briefing. What he did understand, from the moment he arrived at the base, was that something unusual was happening. The security protocols were different. The personnel he encountered had a particular kind of weariness, a look that suggested they were carrying knowledge they couldn't share. People would start conversations and then stop abruptly when they realized he was new to the operation. There was a quality to the base that suggested it was divided into compartments, different areas operating under different rules. The briefing happened 3 days after he arrived in a secure facility within the base. This wasn't standard base office space. This was built specifically for compartmentalized briefings. Concrete walls, no external windows, a single entry point controlled by security personnel. The route to get there was deliberately circuitous, taking him through maintenance areas and administrative sections that seemed designed to obscure the actual location. Once inside, the space was sparse, designed to contain conversation and prevent any signal transmission outside the room. Metal table, wooden chairs, overhead lights mounted high in the ceiling. The kind of space designed for the kind of conversations that don't officially exist.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
Edmond noted the details. The way the concrete had been poured without visible seams, suggesting professional installation. The electrical outlets placed at specific intervals, with what looked like shielding built into the walls. The single door that locked from the inside, with a mechanism that required a key card. Someone had gone to significant expense to create a facility designed to be completely isolated. This wasn't a room where routine briefings happened. This was a room where information was kept so tightly controlled that even the building itself was designed to prevent leakage. The officer running it was a colonel named Harrison, who had the worn look of someone who'd been maintaining a secret so long it had become the shape of his entire career. Edmond would learn later that Harrison had been running the Alaska operations for nearly 15 years, that he'd been involved in the very first documented sightings, that he'd built the entire classified framework around this knowledge. His face showed the geography of decades spent in the field, sun damage from years in remote locations, the particular tiredness that comes from knowing things nobody else is supposed to know. Harrison's hands trembled slightly when he wasn't consciously controlling them, a sign of stress or exhaustion, or both. On the working table in front of him were topographic maps of interior Alaska, satellite imagery showing vegetation patterns and drainage systems, and field reports that had been classified to a level Edmond had never encountered before. Not just confidential or secret. Eyes only, classification, restricted distribution, documentation, controlled at the highest levels. There were also photographs, which Edmond noted with shock. Blurry images, thermal video stills, one photograph that seemed to show a massive figure moving through timber. These weren't drawings or speculations. These were purported documentary evidence of something existing in the landscape. Harrison didn't waste time with preamble. He said, "There's something in the Tanana Valley and the interior drainage systems. We've been documenting movement patterns for the past 2 years. Multiple sightings, consistent reports from indigenous communities in the area, physical evidence we've recovered and stored. The subjects are large, bipedal, and intelligent enough to avoid organized pursuit. They operate in coordinated groups. We don't know the population size. We don't know their exact range. What we know is they're here, and they're actively moving through the territory." Edmond was trained to process information quickly. The military doesn't recruit people for specialized operations and then brief them without expecting them to absorb complex details accurately. But this was different. This required him to override his initial instinct to rationalize what he was hearing. Subjects, bipedal, coordinated groups. The language was clinical, the descriptions were precise, and the implications were extraordinary. Edmond asked the obvious question, "What exactly are we looking for?" Harrison didn't flinch. He understood the scope of what he was communicating. "Undocumented fauna," he said. "We need a better understanding of their behavior, their range, their population dynamics, non-hostile contact if possible, documentation of interaction patterns, behavioral recording, whatever data we can gather to establish a baseline understanding of what we're dealing with. You're going to be part of a team tasked with establishing observation points and gathering systematic data. That's the mission, stripped down to its essentials. Clean, simple, official language that conveyed the extraordinary nature of what was being asked without using terminology that would create additional classified category overhead. Nobody used the word Bigfoot, though the implications were unmistakable. The subjects Harrison was describing matched every historical account, every piece of folklore, every consistent report that had circulated in anthropological circles for decades. Edmond understood immediately what he was being told, even though the official language worked hard to obscure it in the bureaucratic neutrality of military operations speak. The team was 7 people total. Edmond, 2 other reconnaissance specialists named Marcus Whitaker, and David Chen, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Philip Landauer, who had published papers on large primate behavior in journals that Edmond had never heard of, an Army physician called Captain James Voigt, a signal specialist named Thomas Reeves, and an Athabascan guide named Joseph Casca, who had grown up in the interior and knew the land with the kind of deep familiarity that only comes from generations of living in a place. Casca was different from the rest of the team. He was brought in unofficially. He was paid in cash off the books, and his presence was never documented in any official capacity. Edmond understood later that this arrangement protected Casca. It meant he had no official military status, which meant he had no official obligation to maintain silence. If he ever chose to speak about what he experienced, there would be no classified oath he'd violated, no legal consequences he'd face. The military had thought through the contingency of exposure, and they'd structured the arrangements to minimize institutional liability. Casca had seen the subjects before. That became clear during the team briefing. He sat quietly while Harrison laid out the official operational parameters, and then he said something in his quiet voice that changed the frame of the whole operation. He said, "They know people. They've seen people for a long time. They know what we want and what we're afraid of. They test you before they let you see them." That comment, more than anything else Harrison had said, conveyed the reality of what they were dealing with. These weren't animals that needed to be understood through behavioral science alone. These were entities that had already made calculations about human presence, that understood threat and benefit, that made strategic decisions based on their assessment of human behavior. Casca was telling them that they weren't going into the field to discover something unknown. They were going in with prior knowledge that something already knew they were coming. They spent the first 2 weeks preparing, learning the terrain through maps, reviewing satellite imagery, studying the incident reports, and citing documentation that had been accumulated over nearly 20 years. Edmond was given access to files that went back to the 1960s, reports from trappers and rangers and indigenous guides. He spent hours in the secure briefing room, reading through decades of observation. The consistency was remarkable, which was significant in itself. Consistency across time and across multiple independent observers, across different regions of the same state, across people who had no connection to each other and no reason to coordinate their stories, suggested either systematic hoax or genuine phenomenon. The alternative explanations didn't hold up to scrutiny. There was no known network of hoaxers operating in interior Alaska. There was no benefit to generating false reports of unknown fauna in a region with limited communication infrastructure. The reports came from people who had no obvious motivation to lie. A ranger filing a formal report risked his credibility. A guide telling tourists about something he'd seen risked being dismissed as unreliable. A trapper documenting something unusual in his personal journals risked nothing but had everything to lose if someone read those journals and questioned his mental stability. What struck Edmond most was the detail in the older reports, descriptions that were specific but not identical. A sighting from 1962 described the creature as moving with a particular gait. A sighting from 1968 described a similar movement pattern. A sighting from 1971 mentioned the way the subject seemed to evaluate its surroundings before moving. These weren't descriptions that came from a common template. They were observations made by people who were trying to document what they actually saw. The reports described single individuals, sometimes groups of 2 to 4. Sightings concentrated in the draws and riparian corridors, particularly in areas with extensive spruce forest and minimal human presence. Height estimates ranged from 7 to 9 feet. Color descriptions varied from dark brown to reddish, with some reports mentioning a grayish tone in certain lighting conditions. Behavior was described consistently as observant and deliberate, never overtly aggressive, but clearly aware of human presence. Some reports mentioned vocalizations, sounds that weren't consistent with known fauna, low guttural sounds, high-pitched wails, complex sequences that seemed patterned and intentional. Dr. Landauer led the analysis. He was tall, thin, with the kind of careful precision in his speech that suggested years in academic environments. His publication record was impressive: papers on primate social structure, behavioral adaptation, territorial marking in species with high cognitive function. He'd spent field seasons in Africa studying chimpanzees and gorillas. He understood social hierarchy and territorial behavior at a level that few people could claim. What struck Edmond about Landauer was the way he presented the analysis, the care he took to use scientific language and established frameworks. It was as if he was building a structure that would protect the conclusions from being dismissed as speculation. He briefed the team on what behavioral patterns might be consistent with an undocumented species operating in interior Alaska. Social structure would likely be small family groups or loosely associated individuals. Intelligence would operate at a level well above baseline animal behavior, but would still fall within mammalian problem-solving frameworks. Territory would be established and defended, which explained why organized pursuit was ineffective. The subjects would simply abandon an area when human intrusion became unsustainable and move to another section of their range. The interior of Alaska was massive enough to accommodate multiple such territories without forcing direct conflict. But underneath the scientific framing, Edmond sensed that Landauer believed something different, something that didn't fit into the careful language he was using. There were moments when Landauer's eyes would focus on something distant, and his expression would shift to something that looked like concern, or sadness, or recognition of something he wasn't saying out loud. Landauer used the language of primatology, of animal behavior study, of ethology. He drew diagrams on a blackboard, showing how hierarchical social structures might organize around a dominant male and supporting family units. He described how territory could be marked and maintained. He explained how intelligence levels consistent with chimpanzee or gorilla cognition would allow for planning, for strategy, for adaptation to changing circumstances. He framed the whole thing in scientific terms that made it comprehensible and manageable. It was logical. It was scientific. It was designed to make the whole thing sound manageable. Edmond understood later that this briefing had been constructed specifically to prevent the kind of panic that might result from being told that something unknown, something large and intelligent, was operating in the territory they were supposed to be securing. If you frame it as wildlife biology, if you use the proper terminology, if you anchor it in established science, it becomes just another military operation, a mission, a problem to be solved through systematic observation and data gathering. But there was an undertone, that Landauer never explicitly addressed, the questions he didn't ask, the data he didn't request, the behavioral contingencies he didn't outline. All of those gaps seem to suggest that Landauer already knew more than he was saying in the briefing, that there were aspects of the subject's behavior that weren't fitting into the standard primatology framework he was presenting. Edmond would find out later that this was true, that Landauer had done private research, had reviewed literature that wasn't in the official military files, had developed his own hypotheses about what they might be dealing with. But all of that remained unspoken during the preparation phase. They inserted into the field in late April, a helicopter drop into a remote valley about 60 miles south of the base, in terrain that was still partially snow-covered but transitioning to spring conditions. The valley was selected based on Casca's recommendation and Harrison's analysis of the sighting data. Casca had spent time there as a young man, had heard stories from his grandfather about the place, about the things that lived in the deep country. He'd marked it on maps, referenced it in conversations, and when he walked the data with Harrison and the team, his assessment was definitive. This is where they are. This is where they always come back to. He was speaking from knowledge that went deeper than reports or sightings. He was speaking from the kind of understanding that came from living in a landscape for generations. The coordinates put them in an area that seemed to mark the intersection of multiple reported sightings, a zone where the subjects appeared to concentrate activity. No trail, no settlement, just dense spruce forest running up the valley sides with bottomland that was starting to green as the snow melted. The helicopter landed on a flat bench of gravel, held position for 15 minutes while the team unloaded gear, and then lifted off without waiting for confirmation that the camp was established. As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, Edmond felt the weight of isolation descend. They were 70 miles from the nearest military base, hundreds of miles from any settlement. They were in country where help, if it came, would take time to arrive. They were completely dependent on themselves and on their ability to maintain operational security. They were equipped extensively. Field kits with everything needed to survive 6 weeks in interior Alaska. Recording equipment, multiple cameras, thermal imaging systems that were state-of-the-art for 1975, long-range observation gear, binoculars, spotting scopes, the kind of equipment that would allow observation from positions that minimized human presence, satellite communication systems that gave them direct access to Fort Greely and could be operated without audible radio transmission. Weapons, though Harrison had been specific about their use. They were defensive only. Under no circumstances were they to fire on the subjects unless there was immediate threat to life. The goal was documentation, not confrontation. Edmond described the moment of insertion as surreal, the helicopter lifting off and disappearing into the distance, leaving the team in absolute silence except for the sound of wind through the spruce. The isolation was immediate and total. They were now completely removed from the institutional structure of the base. They were dependent on themselves and their training. They had satellite communication for emergencies, but emergency deployment of military assets to extract them would mean abandonment of the mission and significant explanation to command about why the operation had failed. The valley they'd been inserted into was approximately 3 miles long and a mile wide. Mountainous terrain rose on both sides, with the highest slopes still carrying snow. The creek ran north to south, draining into the larger river system that eventually fed into the Tanana. The team's first task was to establish a base camp in a defensible position that would be hidden from casual observation, but provide them with supply security and shelter. They chose a spot on the elevated bench where the helicopter had landed, using natural features to conceal the camp, while providing sight lines down the valley and up into the higher terrain. The work was methodical and exhausting, setting up tents, establishing a perimeter, stockpiling food and supplies, organizing the equipment. It took them 3 days to establish the camp to an acceptable standard. During that time, they saw no sign of the subjects. Casca moved through the area, reading sign with the kind of precision that showed he knew exactly what he was looking for. Animal trails, scat, browsing patterns. He was mapping the territory, establishing a baseline understanding of what lived here and how it moved. The first month was boring in the way field operations are boring. Setting up the camp, establishing observation points at high vantage locations overlooking the valley approaches, running transect lines through the valley floor to look for physical sign, tracking, scat analysis, hair samples where they could find them, all the methodical work of documenting an environment and establishing baseline understanding of what organisms inhabited the territory. Nothing dramatic, no encounters, no direct sightings, just the forest and the work. Days fell into routine. Wake before dawn, check equipment, rotate observation shifts. 2 people on high ground observation at any given time, while the others maintained the camp, processed samples, reviewed equipment, organized data. Landauer set up a portable laboratory of sorts, a tent equipped with specimen containers, measuring devices, preservative materials. He was documenting everything. Hair samples went into labeled containers. Scat was photographed before being preserved. Anything that suggested subject activity was recorded in detail with location coordinates and date stamps. Casca kept saying they were being observed. He'd say it casually, as if remarking on the weather. We're being watched from the ridge today. There's something in the thick timber to the north. They know we're here. They're testing us. Edmond initially dismissed it as guide's intuition or paranoia, born from growing up in territory, where larger carnivores were a constant presence and where you had to maintain constant awareness of the predators you shared the landscape with. But Whitaker, who had the best survival instincts in the group, a man trained in wilderness navigation and field survival, started noticing the same patterns Casca was describing. The quality of silence was different at certain times. A complete absence of bird sound, of insect noise, of the ambient forest background. It was as if something triggered a biological response in the ecosystem, a recognition that a predator was present, that normal activity should cease. The way birds would shift their behavior, settling on different perches, their vocalizations changing tone and frequency. The way the forest felt different, a sensation that you were being paid attention to, that something other than yourself was aware of your location and your movements. Edmond described it as a developing awareness. At first he dismissed the sensations as psychological, projection, the kind of paranoia that could develop when you were isolated and expecting something to appear. But as the sensation recurred, as it happened in consistent ways, at consistent times of day, with consistent correlations to position and movement, it became difficult to rationalize away. Something was aware of them. Something was watching their behavior and responding to it. Whether that something was the subjects they were there to document remained unconfirmed, but the evidence was accumulating. It was during one of these observation periods, near the end of May, that Chen made the first direct sighting. He'd been on the observation point for roughly 90 minutes, running surveillance on a drainage that Casca had identified as likely travel corridor. The day was clear, unusual for interior Alaska, with visibility that extended several miles across the valley. The light had that particular quality it gets in late spring in the north, the sun lower in the sky creating long shadows that made depth perception challenging. Chen was watching a stand of willow and birch where a creek emerged from the upland when he saw movement, large movement, deliberate, crossing a clearing maybe a mile distant, not the movement of a moose or bear, something bigger, something moving with purpose, bipedal, upright. Chen's hands were steady as he reached for the radio. He radioed it in calm, clinical, the way trained observers do, the kind of voice that comes from discipline and training, from doing this work professionally, slow-moving, two-legged, large mass, dark coloration, maybe brownish. Walking upright through the clearing headed toward the timber on the far side, stopped for maybe 30 seconds, appeared to look around, then continued into forest and disappeared. Edmond and Whitaker got to the observation point in under 5 minutes, moving through the forest at a speed that would have been reckless in normal circumstances, but was the only way to possibly catch another glimpse of whatever had been seen. Chen was still there, watching through high-powered binoculars, but the clearing was empty. Whatever it was, it had covered the remaining distance to the timber and vanished into the trees. Landauer showed up maybe 20 minutes later, arriving with that careful scientist's deliberation. That was his trademark. The consensus was straightforward. They'd seen something large, unidentified, and in bipedal locomotion. The description was consistent with prior sightings. The movement pattern suggested intelligence. The size was consistent with estimates from other reports. They'd made visual contact with a subject. Edmond felt his understanding of the operation shift in that moment. Up until that point, despite everything he'd been briefed on, there was still a part of him that held the possibility that this was an elaborate training exercise, that Harrison and the military had constructed an elaborate scenario to test the team. Now, with Chen's calm clinical description, with the physical confirmation that something existed in this valley, the reality settled over him. They were documenting something real. The mood in camp shifted. Now they knew for certain that they weren't just documenting territory. They were in the presence of something real, something tangible. Casca wasn't smug about it, but he did say he told them so. The thing to do now, he said, was figure out where they lived. The territory had to have a den site, a home base. You find that, you find them. The search for a den took 2 weeks. They expanded their observation points, establishing additional positions at higher elevations where they could scan broader territories. They ran more transect lines through drainages and valley bottoms, looking for tracks and sign. They looked for trails that showed signs of repeated use, areas where the vegetation was disturbed in ways that suggested habitation. The bark stripped from willows at specific heights, moss and lichen worn away from rocks that were used repeatedly as passage points, ground depressions that suggested beds or resting areas. Edmond described this phase as forensic archaeology applied to a living landscape. Reading the story the forest was telling about how something large had been moving through it, where it spent time, where it returned to repeatedly. It was slow work. It required patience and the kind of attention to detail that most people don't naturally possess. But Casca had those skills. He could read the landscape the way Edmond had learned to read military tactical maps. Every mark meant something. Every sign pointed to behavior and intention. Casca found it first, or rather he found the evidence pointing toward it. A canyon system about 8 miles north of the camp, accessible by a drainage that ran water in the spring melt but would be dry or near dry by summer. He'd been tracking sign, following traces of movement that seemed to form a deliberate pattern. Not random wildlife activity, but purposeful travel. Edmond joined him on the 2nd day of this tracking work, moving through the forest with the kind of stealth that came from military training and weeks of field work. They followed the canyon drainage upstream, moving slowly, looking at every tree, every rock, every patch of disturbed ground. The marks accumulated, scat samples that suggested heavy predation, hair caught on branches at heights that only a very large animal could reach. A place where the bark of a spruce tree had been torn away, not by disease or storm damage, but deliberately, as if something large had pushed against the tree with considerable force. Claw marks, maybe, or just the pressure of a massive body against the bark. The canyon they were following got progressively steeper. The creek cut deeper into the landscape. The forest opened up slightly as the canyon walls became too vertical to support heavy timber. They moved into an area of large boulders, areas where the stream had eroded the stone and created a maze of rocks and gaps and small caves. places where something could hide, places where something could establish a den. The canyon itself was extraordinary. The sides were steep, almost vertical in some sections, heavily forested with dense spruce and ancient birch trees. The deepest part opened into a rock face where the stone formations had been shaped by millennia of water and erosion. In the base of that formation, partially concealed by the overhang of the cliff edge, was a cave opening, large enough for something substantial to enter and move through, dark enough that the interior was completely obscured from observation from the canyon floor. Around the cave entrance, the signs were unmistakable to anyone trained to read landscape. A trail, worn into the rocky ground from repeated travel, not random movement, but habitual passage from specific entry and exit points. Cached brush material that looked deliberately arranged, not natural windfall, but stacked in ways that suggested intentional placement. Scat that was large, much larger than anything Edmond expected from known Alaskan fauna, consistent with descriptions from prior reports. This was it. A den site, clearly actively used, occupied by something that Landauer estimated was probably a family group based on the variation in track sizes, from prints that seemed to belong to an adult to prints that were notably much smaller, juvenile-sized. They didn't approach the cave directly. Casca made that call, and Edmond supported it. Direct approach was tactically unsound. It would alert the subjects to the precise location of human interest. It would potentially trigger defensive response. Instead, they established a remote observation point on the canyon rim, approximately 300 yards from the cave entrance, overlooking the approach trails and the cave opening. They chose a location that provided natural concealment, nestled in rocks and brush, elevated enough to provide sight lines to the cave and the approach trails, but low enough in profile that the subjects coming in or out wouldn't easily spot them. They set up sophisticated equipment, infrared motion sensors on the trails leading into the canyon, devices that would trigger silently and transmit data back to the observation point. A passive camera system that would trigger from heat signatures and movement, recording to film that would have to be processed later, but that wouldn't require electronic power or make audible sounds that might alert the subjects. The equipment was designed for surveillance with absolute minimal human footprint. No sounds, no lights, no presence that could be detected by anything monitoring the area. Then they waited. That became the rhythm. Hours of observation, recording position, documenting anything that happened. The quality of waiting in a field operation is specific. You're alert, attentive, focused, but you're not doing anything active. You're not moving toward the objective. You're receiving data, processing it, making recordings. Edmond described it as meditative in a way, except that the meditation was structured entirely around maintaining awareness of threat and opportunity. The first week of observations yielded nothing. The cave appeared completely unoccupied. No activity, no motion triggers on the sensors, no camera captures. Edmond was starting to wonder if they'd been too obvious in their approach, despite the precautions. Had the subjects detected them anyway? Had they abandoned the den site and moved to another location in their territory? Was the entire operation going to result in finding a den that had been recently active but was now abandoned? Casca sat with Edmond during one of the observation rotations and explained what was happening. The observation of nothing was itself information. They weren't in the cave, Casca said. They were staying away because they'd detected you. They know you're watching the cave. They're waiting for you to leave. It's a test. They need to know if you're a permanent threat or temporary intrusion. Animals don't behave this way. Predators don't retreat from territory and remain absent for sustained periods. They come back. They defend what's theirs. The subjects were doing something different. They were evaluating, calculating whether human presence was a temporary inconvenience or a permanent colonization of their territory. Landauer was intrigued by this behavioral model. If it was correct, if the subjects were intelligent enough to recognize observation and respond with strategic avoidance, that would support the conclusion that they possessed significant cognitive abilities. The waiting game was part of their normal interaction with threats. Establish that you know they're watching, then see if they'll accept your presence as non-hostile. 3 days of observation passed with no activity. Edmond was starting to think Casca's theory was correct, that the subjects had detected the observation point and had deliberately abandoned the den to test whether human presence was temporary. But Whitaker maintained position through the night of July 3rd, running night surveillance equipment, watching the canyon entrance through thermal imaging scopes. At approximately 02:47 hours, a heat signature appeared at the cave entrance. Large heat signature. The thermal imaging captured an individual that was definitely bipedal, definitely massive, moving with deliberation through the cave opening and into the canyon. Within minutes, a second heat signature appeared, smaller, juvenile-sized based on the thermal profile. They approached the canyon floor and began moving deliberately toward higher ground, seeming to scout the territory, ensuring that the observation point they'd detected earlier was still occupied, but still at distance. 3 days later, the motion sensors triggered. Whitaker was monitoring the equipment, had set up a rotation where someone was always watching the screens, and when the first heat signature registered, he maintained absolute silence, waiting to see if it would resolve into something meaningful. It did. A large heat signature, moving down the canyon toward the cave entrance. Then a second, smaller signature. Then a third, moving further back, staying in the shadows. They were coming down together, a coordinated approach, a family movement. The camera system captured images of 2 individuals approaching the cave entrance at approximately 0300 hours. One larger, approximately 7.5 feet tall, dark brown coloration, moving with clear purpose and no apparent concern about the observation point. No caution, no careful assessment. It moved like something that had walked this path 1,000 times, that knew every rock and every tree, that owned this territory with the absolute confidence that came from knowing you were the apex predator. One smaller, possibly juvenile, moving with less confidence, stepping carefully, sometimes pausing to look around before continuing. The images were grainy, limited to thermal signatures but unambiguous. 2 separate creatures, bipedal locomotion, humanoid body structure, cave entry behavior. The bigger individual was carrying something, though the thermal imaging couldn't resolve what. Landauer suggested it was probably a kill, maybe an elk or moose calf. Prey brought back to the den to be processed and stored. Edmond was struck by the normality of the behavior. This wasn't an exotic display. This wasn't something unusual or remarkable from the perspective of the creature. This was a parent bringing food back to the den. This was exactly the kind of behavior that human mothers displayed, that bear mothers displayed, that any creature with dependent young would display. It was mundane. It was natural. It was proof of family structure and provisioning behavior that suggested intelligence and social organization. After that first contact, the frequency of sightings increased dramatically. Sometimes one individual, sometimes groups of 3 or 4. They seemed to be testing the boundaries, pushing closer to the observation point, retreating when directly approached, but returning each time with slightly less caution. It was as if they'd made a calculation. The observation point was permanent. The human presence wasn't leaving, but the humans hadn't attacked. The humans had shown no aggression, therefore coexistence might be possible. Landauer documented all of it with meticulous precision, movement patterns, showing clear routines, and territorial behavior, group compositions, which showed at least 1 juvenile and what appeared to be possibly 1 or 2 other individuals besides the apparent alpha. Apparent social interactions, the way the subjects related to each other, the gestures they used, the sounds they made. One evening, 2 of the individuals appeared to be engaged in what looked like play fighting, rolling on the ground near the cave entrance, making low vocalizations that Edmond described as surprisingly gentle, almost affectionate. These weren't behaviors associated with territorial defense or resource competition. These were behaviors associated with bonding, with relationship maintenance, with social activity that suggested a family structure. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's get into the story. By the middle of June, the team had established something that resembled routine contact. The subjects seemed to accept human presence as a consistent element of their territory. The initial wariness had diminished. The subjects still maintained distance, still showed caution, but they no longer fled when they detected the observation point. They came and went from the canyon, moving through the landscape with the kind of confidence that came from territorial knowledge and established patterns of movement. The smallest one, the juvenile, showed the most curiosity of all the subjects. It approached the observation point several times over the span of a week, seemingly investigating the equipment, trying to understand what the humans were doing there. Edmond described these moments as extraordinary. This creature, which by all reasonable assessment should have been terrified of humans, should have treated them as threats, instead approached with what could only be described as inquisitiveness. It would get close to equipment and sniff at it, try to manipulate objects with its hands, then retreat to safe distance and observe. There was never any aggression in these encounters, never any display of threat, never any indication that the juvenile or any of the other subjects were considering attacking. When Whitaker once moved suddenly to adjust a camera, all of the subjects simply retreated to distance and waited. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They observed the movement, determined it wasn't immediately threatening, and pulled back to give the humans space. It was behavior that suggested significant intelligence and impulse control. Edmond began keeping a more personal log, in addition to the official documentation that he knew would be classified. Personal observations, reflections, the sensation of what it was like to be in the presence of these creatures. He wrote about the quality of attention they paid to humans, the way they seemed to assess Edmond and Whitaker and the others, evaluating them the way humans might evaluate animals in the wild. There was something unsettling about being studied with that kind of intensity. It inverted the normal relationship between observer and observed. It made Edmond aware that they weren't just documenting creatures, they were being documented by creatures. Edmond began to wonder if the whole point of their presence had shifted. Initially, they were there to document and gather data, but as the weeks progressed and peaceful contact continued, it felt like maybe the intent was becoming something different. Recognition, mutual acknowledgement that something existed here that didn't fit into normal categories, and both parties knew it. In late June, Dr. Landauer made a decision that wasn't authorized by anyone at the base, and that he kept off the official record. He wanted to attempt direct communication, not capture, not threatening contact. Communication. He proposed leaving food at a specific location, something clearly provided by human hands, and observing whether the subjects would accept it. The proposal was risky. It violated operational protocols. It could compromise the mission. It could trigger a response that the team wasn't prepared for. Edmond wasn't sure it was smart, but Landauer was adamant. He argued that documentation was only half the mission. The other half was understanding. They documented behavior, but behavior alone wasn't enough. They needed to understand cognition. They needed to understand whether these creatures operated on pure instinct or whether they possessed reasoning capability. Food provisioning was a test. It was a way of asking a question. "This is the question that matters," he said. "Are we dealing with animals that can be conditioned with food, the way a bear can be drawn to a camp by garbage, the way wolves can be manipulated through prey placement, Or are we dealing with something that understands the act of provision as a gesture of relationship? Are we dealing with something that can understand that a gift has been offered? They left a deer carcass at the canyon entrance, not hidden, clearly visible, positioned to indicate intentional placement. Then they retreated to the observation point and waited. The subjects found it within 8 hours. The larger one approached first, spent time investigating the carcass and the area around it, assessing for threat. Then it did something that Edmond still described as extraordinary. It vocalized, a low guttural sound that resonated through the canyon, and from somewhere deeper in the terrain, another sound answered. A response. Communication. Within minutes, the 3 other individuals Edmond had been documenting emerged and approached the carcass. They fed, but they did something else, too. They moved the carcass to a more protected location, partially concealed by rocks and brush. They weren't just eating. They were securing a resource, using problem-solving to maximize the utility of what had been provided. When they left, an hour after arriving, they made sounds again, low, rhythmic, repeated. Casca said it was something like gratitude. Edmond had no way to verify that interpretation, but Landauer seemed convinced. We're not dealing with animals, Landauer said. Animals don't think in terms of obligation. These do. Over the next 2 weeks, they left additional provisions. Not constantly, but at measured intervals. A deer here, an elk quarter there. Each time, the subjects would find it, consume it, and respond with vocalizations that seemed patterned and intentional. Landauer was convinced they were hearing language, or at least a proto-linguistic system of communication and meaning-making. The arrangement was complicated by an unexpected visit from the base. A command helicopter arrived in early July with Colonel Harrison and a small security team. The official purpose was resupply. The real purpose was inspection. Harrison wanted to see the observation station, review the documentation, and understand what data had been gathered. Edmond and Whitaker brought him to the canyon observation point and showed him the video footage and camera captures. They showed him the thermal imaging, the movement patterns, the evidence of den occupation and food provisioning. Harrison was quiet for a long time. He reviewed everything, asked detailed questions about dating and verification, and then he said something that changed the trajectory of the entire operation. "This is classified above my current level," he said. "You've documented something that's going to require escalation. I'm going to have to report this to higher command, and when I do, decisions are going to be made that I won't be able to influence. My advice is that you finalize your documentation as quickly as possible and prepare for extraction." "What kind of decisions?" Edmond asked. "The kind that happen when you document the existence of something that doesn't fit into any established category. The kind that make people very nervous." Harrison paused. "I've been running this operation for 2 years," he said. "The primary objective was never to understand these creatures. It was to verify that they existed and establish their location. You've done both. Now the situation becomes political. Military oversight, interagency coordination, classification protocols. What happens next isn't within my authority. Within a week, orders came through for extraction. The team was given 72 hours to complete their work, pack their equipment, and prepare for helicopter pickup. The rationale given was that summer conditions were deteriorating, that the window for safe extraction was closing. Edmond knew that was a cover story. Something about their findings had triggered a response at higher levels, and now the operation was being shut down and folded into something larger. The last days in the field were strange. Edmond described them as surreal, moving through normal operations knowing that the boundary had shifted. Landauer pushed to maintain the food provisions right up until the end. He left a final deer carcass positioned at the canyon entrance the morning of extraction, and when the subjects emerged to feed, he recorded it on video. All of it. The approach, the feeding, the vocalizations, the evident acceptance of human presence without aggression or fear. When the helicopter arrived on July 18th, the subjects watched from a distance. Casca said later that they knew something was changing. An arrangement was being broken. That was why they came closer as the pickup happened, moving to the canyon edge as the aircraft lifted off. Edmond saw them in the window as the helicopter climbed, all four of them standing upright, watching the team depart. No apparent distress, just observation, the acknowledgement that something had shifted in their territory. Back at Fort Greely, the team was processed through debrief protocols. Each member was interviewed separately by military intelligence officers, their statements recorded, their findings catalogued. The officers who conducted the interviews were different from anyone Edmond had encountered before. They weren't scientists. They weren't researchers. They were people whose job was to contain information, to extract it, to understand its implications, and to ensure that it remained contained. Their questions were precise and relentless. They asked about the creature's behavior repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies. They asked about the team's observations, testing whether the stories held together. They asked about physical evidence, documentation, anything that could be used to verify or deny what had been claimed. The footage and photographs were secured into classified storage. Equipment was inventoried and filed. The operation was officially closed. Edmond was reassigned to administrative duties and given a clear directive from an officer whose name he was never given, who spoke with the kind of authority that suggested very high institutional standing. What happened in the interior remains compartmentalized. You've documented something, but its existence and the nature of your findings are classified above your access level. You will not discuss this with anyone. You will not maintain copies of documentation. You will not speculate about findings or forward information outside official channels. You will not attempt to contact other team members. You will not pursue further research on this topic. You will move forward with your military career, and you will maintain the security oath you've sworn. Do you understand? He understood. They all did. The unspoken message was clear. Compliance would be rewarded. Non-compliance would have consequences that Edmond could not afford. But Edmond was smart enough to understand that institutional memory is fallible and that institutions can be overthrown or reformed. He was smart enough to know that someday, decades in the future, this operation might be reviewed by people with different priorities. He was smart enough to preserve something before everything was sealed. Detailed field notes, written by hand, small enough to hide in a book or under a floorboard, comprehensive enough to serve as a record. He wrote everything from memory the night before he left the field, filling nearly 200 pages of a standard military journal with his observations. He kept them hidden for nearly 50 years, maintaining the security protocol that had been drilled into him, even as he preserved the truth. He didn't mention the operation to anyone. Not his wife, not his children, not fellow veterans. It remained sealed inside him, a compartment of his life that he accessed only in private moments, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep. It remained sealed until 2023, when he decided the time had come to speak, when he understood that he was running out of time, when he realized that the truth was more important than the silence. What happened after the extraction was something that Edmond only pieced together through fragments. Conversations overheard, bureaucratic echoes, hints about what had been decided at higher levels. The data from the operation, the documentation of the subjects and their behavior, had been used to establish protocols. Fort Greely and the surrounding interior country was designated as restricted territory for purposes of wildlife management. Officially, the restriction was for ecological preservation. Unofficially, it was to establish a buffer zone. The subjects were real, documented, and the decision had been made to monitor them without direct intervention. But there was more. Edmond eventually understood that the operation hadn't been designed purely for documentation. The military had been concerned about intelligence gathering by foreign powers. If the Soviets learned that the United States had documented unknown fauna in strategic territory, it could complicate diplomatic and military calculations. Better to keep it classified, keep it quiet, control the narrative. What Edmond struggled with most was what happened to Dr. Landauer. The biologist had been reassigned within a month of extraction, ordered to a research facility in Nevada that Edmond could never quite pin down. Edmond tried multiple times to track him down. He called universities where Landauer might have contacts. He searched for publications under Landauer's name in scientific journals. Nothing. It was as if Landauer had stepped out of the public record and into a classified system from which he never emerged. Landauer himself had submitted a paper to the academic community attempting to publish his findings, what he'd learned in Alaska, what the behavioral documentation suggested. The manuscript had been intercepted before it even reached an editor. Edmond found out about this when Landauer mentioned it in passing during a phone call that was likely monitored. Landauer seemed to have accepted that publication was impossible, that his research would remain locked in classified systems. He seemed depressed about it, though he tried to hide it behind academic formality. Edmond tried to maintain contact with him after Landauer was transferred, but Landauer's communications became sporadic and then ceased entirely. There was one final letter, sent through an indirect mail route, that took 3 months to arrive. In it, Landauer wrote about the work he was doing, which Edmond understood to mean that he was still studying captured subjects. He wrote about the implications of what he was learning, about the intelligence he was documenting, about the ethical concerns that were keeping him awake. Then the letters stopped. Edmond never heard from Landauer again. By the late 80s, Edmond had accepted that his colleague had been absorbed into the classified military research apparatus and was never going to be heard from publicly again. He wondered if Landauer was still alive. He wondered if he was still working in that facility in Nevada. He wondered if Landauer ever thought about the canyon in Alaska, about the creatures they'd documented there, about the moment when they'd chosen to offer food as a gesture of peace. This is the part of Edmond's story that he emphasized when he finally spoke about it. The documentation matters. The proof that they exist matters. But what matters more is understanding that institutions function to contain what doesn't fit. If something doesn't align with established categories, established science, established military priorities, then it gets classified and compartmentalized. The system is designed to protect institutional authority, not to protect truth. The creatures in the interior of Alaska are still there, Edmond believes, still undocumented officially, still protected by their remoteness and by the military's vested interest in maintaining the silence. And the people who documented them are scattered, isolated, prevented from speaking publicly. The system works. I asked him what he thinks would happen if the findings were declassified, if the data and documentation were made public. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It would change everything. Not the creatures themselves. They'd adapt like they always have. But it would change how we understand ourselves. We've built our world on the assumption that we're alone in an important way, that the large intelligence on the planet is exclusively human. Documentation of something else, something that exists in parallel to us, surviving in the margins, that breaks the frame. And institutions are designed to maintain the frame." Before Edmond ended our conversation, he gave me something. A copy of his original field notes, handwritten, dated entries from June and July of 1975. They're detailed, they're clinical, they're exactly the kind of documentation a trained observer would produce. But underneath the clinical language, there's something else. Respect, wonder, the sense of someone who had encountered something profound and was trying to make sense of it within the constraints of military protocol and the limitations of language. One entry stands out. Dated June 23, 1975, the juvenile approached within 6 feet of the observation point. We maintained silence and stillness. It studied the equipment carefully. examining each piece, trying to understand what these objects were and why they existed in its territory. Then it seemed to see me through the scope of the spotting lens. For approximately 3 minutes we observed each other. No fear on either side, no aggression, just recognition. Dr. Landauer theorizes that this is how contact ought to occur, not as conquest or study, but as mutual acknowledgement of existence. Two conscious beings, aware of each other, evaluating each other, deciding whether coexistence was possible. When the juvenile finally left, it made a sound that Casca says means something like "until we meet again." I believe him. The sound was different from the other vocalizations we've documented. It had a structure that suggested intentionality. It seemed directed at me specifically, as if the juvenile was responding to the moment we'd just shared. It seemed to suggest continuity, as if what had happened was significant enough to warrant acknowledgement and perhaps commitment to future interaction. For months afterward, Edmond would think about that moment. He would wonder what had passed between him and that creature, what had been understood on both sides of that encounter. He would wonder if mutual recognition had occurred, if some kind of communication had happened that existed beyond language, beyond the categories that science and institution imposed on understanding. That's Edmond's account of what happened at Fort Greely in the summer of 1975. He carried it alone for nearly 50 years. He's 87 now, still living in Fairbanks, still watching the news and the academic journals for any indication that something has changed, that the documentation he participated in has somehow made it into public record. It hasn't. The operation remains classified. The subjects remain undocumented in any official capacity. But Edmond remains convinced of what he witnessed. He remains convinced that the creatures exist, that they're intelligent, that they're aware of human presence, and that there's an ongoing arrangement between military institutions and the reality of their existence. An arrangement that maintains silence in exchange for a buffer zone of protection. I asked him if he regretted participating in the operation. His answer was complicated. "No," he said. "I regret the secrecy. I regret that Dr. Landauer was absorbed into the classified system and disappeared from public life. I regret that what we learned was locked away instead of contributing to human understanding. But participating in the operation itself, no. We treated them with respect. We documented them carefully. We recognized what they were. In a world designed to erase them, we at least bore witness. That has to mean something." In the late 90s, as Edmond moved into his 60s and had been out of the military for over 2 decades, he started becoming more active in veteran communities in Alaska. He attended gatherings held in Fairbanks and other towns, listening to other veterans talk about their experiences. He became involved with organized groups focused on Cold War-era operations and secret military programs, groups of aging military personnel who were starting to talk about things they'd been silent about for decades. These gatherings had a particular character. There was an unspoken understanding that certain topics had been compartmentalized, certain experiences couldn't be discussed in public, certain knowledge had to remain classified or careers would be destroyed. He eventually started encountering fragments of information that suggested he wasn't alone in having witnessed things that were later classified and buried by institutional machinery. Other veterans had stories, real stories. Stories they only shared in private, in spaces where they believed no one was listening, experiences they carried, things they'd seen or been assigned to that didn't fit into the official historical record, things that institutions had worked hard to keep concealed. One man, a former pilot, had been involved in aerial reconnaissance missions over remote regions. He described seeing structures that didn't appear on any map, installations that seemed to exist outside official military documentation. Another veteran, who'd worked in communications, described intercepting messages about classified operations that he wasn't supposed to have access to. Messages that referenced activities in territories that officially didn't exist. A third, a ranger with the Forest Service, described being told to redirect reports, to classify certain sightings, to ensure that certain documentation never made it into official channels. Some of those stories were dismissed as psychological issues, or the exaggeration of memory that happens over decades. That's the standard institutional response. If you report something that doesn't fit official categories, the first response is to question your mental state. Were you drinking? Were you on medication? Have you ever sought psychiatric treatment? By raising these questions, institutions can undermine the credibility of the witness without actually engaging with the substance of what they're claiming. But some of these stories, when Edmond listened carefully and paid attention to the details, were remarkably coherent, consistent, detailed in ways that suggested real experience rather than fabricated narratives. Some were taken seriously, at least by other veterans. They formed networks of people who'd experienced something, who'd been told to keep quiet about it, who carried the weight of secret knowledge the way Edmond had carried it. Edmond began to suspect, based on these encounters and conversations, that the Fort Greely operation was part of something larger, a broader government interest in undocumented fauna that went beyond the original 1975 operation. Multiple operations, multiple teams, sustained institutional engagement with the question of unknown large primates in North American wilderness. If there were operations in the Brooks Range and the Wrangell-St. Elias, if there were operations along the coastal ranges, then the military interest in documenting and locating these creatures was systematic. It wasn't reactive, it wasn't defensive, it was proactive intelligence, gathering on a regional scale. This suspicion was confirmed dramatically in 2001 when he met a retired Forest Service official named David Morrow, who had worked in interior Alaska during the same period. Morrow was attending a veteran gathering in Fairbanks, participating in a panel discussion about Cold War-era operations in remote regions. During the informal period after the panel, Morrow approached Edmond and said quietly that he'd heard a reference to the Fort Greely operation during one of the presentations, and he wanted to know if Edmond had direct knowledge of it. Morrow had documented reports of large bipedal creatures from rangers and guides working in the interior during the mid to late 70s. He'd compiled those reports, included them in official Forest Service documentation, and tried to report his findings through official channels. His reports had been redirected from the Forest Service chain of command to military intelligence, and he'd been informed by a contact at Fort Greely that the matter was now classified and outside his jurisdictional authority. Morrow had spent 30 years wondering if he'd imagined the institutional response or if it had been real. The redirection had been explicit but not documented. A phone call, a conversation, a clear message that the matter was now beyond his official capacity. When Edmond confirmed that he had direct knowledge of the military classification, that he'd been part of a systematic operation to document the subjects, Morrow was both relieved and disturbed. Relief that his experience had been externally validated, that someone else had encountered the institutional machinery that had silenced him. Relief that the redirect hadn't been some kind of bureaucratic error or misunderstanding. Disturbance that it meant the situation was exactly as he'd feared and suspected. Something real had been documented. It had been taken into a classified system and had never emerged into public discourse. It had been compartmentalized and dispersed. The people involved had been isolated, and the knowledge had been maintained in sealed institutional archives. Over the next decade, from roughly 2001 through 2011, Edmond and Morrow researched the question as thoroughly as two civilians without institutional access could. They compiled lists of reports, documented sighting locations, reviewed geological surveys and ecological data from multiple sources. They interviewed guides, rangers, trappers, anyone who worked in the interior and might have encountered something they couldn't explain. The interviews were conducted carefully, with Edmond often presenting himself as someone interested in wildlife documentation, rather than as someone looking for confirmation of something specific. People talk more freely when they don't think you're trying to prove something. That was Edmond's philosophy. The conversations they had with old-timers in remote Alaskan communities were remarkable. Consistent descriptions of large bipedal creatures, stories of encounters passed down through families, tales of missing people, usually attributed to accidents or getting lost, but occasionally with details that suggested something else. A trapper who'd abandoned a cabin after something large moved through it during the night, leaving massive handprints on the walls but no actual breach. A guide who'd watched 4 clients refuse to continue into a particular drainage after encountering tracks that looked humanoid but were far too large to be human. A ranger who'd found a shelter, clearly constructed by something with significant strength and intelligence, that looked deliberately abandoned before his first patrol of the season. The interior of Alaska, particularly the Tanana Valley, the Copper River drainage, and the high country around the Alaska Range, seemed to emerge as concentrated areas of activity. The sightings were consistent over time. The behaviors described in various reports matched the patterns Edmond had observed firsthand during the 1975 operation. Territorial behavior, family group structure, apparent hunting activity, avoidance of direct human confrontation. The creatures were real, established in the landscape, and the military institution had documented them during the Fort Greely operation and knew they existed. Morrow had something that Edmond didn't initially realize was significant. Access to Forest Service records, archives that went back decades, storage facilities full of paper files that had been filed and then neglected because they didn't fit into standard wildlife management categories. Old reports dating back to the 1950s, sightings documented by rangers, guides, trappers. Some were formal reports, submitted through official channels. Some were informal notes in logbooks. Some were hearsay, documented secondhand, because the original witness refused to put their name on a report that might affect their professional standing. Most of these had been filed under miscellaneous or other, filed away, rather than investigated or compiled. The Forest Service had been organized around the management of timber and wildlife within established categories. Unknown fauna didn't have a management category, so the reports were accepted and filed but not acted upon. The system had no framework for what to do with them. But when Morrow pulled them all together, spending years in archives and making copies of old files, a pattern emerged that was remarkable. A consistent geographical distribution, with sightings concentrated in the same regions Edmond had documented, consistent descriptions across different time periods, with the behavioral patterns described in 1957 matching the patterns described in 1973. Consistent behavioral patterns across decades of independent observers, people who had no reason to coordinate their stories because most of them had never spoken to each other. The consistency was so striking that it became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The more they researched, the more they understood that what they were investigating was part of something larger. Morrow had access to Forest Service records, and he began to carefully extract documentation that suggested a pattern of interest and involvement, not just the one redirect of his own reports. There were other redirects, reports from guides that had been submitted through official channels and had disappeared into classified systems, documentation that suggested systematic attention to the question of unknown fauna in interior regions. Other operations existed. In the late 70s and early 80s, there had been what appeared to be additional military operations focused on documentation and monitoring in remote regions of Alaska. Edmond found fragments of evidence suggesting that at least 3 other operations similar to the Fort Greely project had been conducted. One in the Brooks Range, one in the Wrangell-St. Elias Wilderness, one in the coastal mountains southeast of Anchorage. The evidence was fragmentary, mostly inference and pattern analysis, but the consistency was striking. All of the operations seemed to follow the same pattern: short-term field operations, typically lasting 6 to 8 weeks. Small teams of military personnel supplemented by civilian guides, systematic documentation of subjects, behavior, location, population indicators, extraction, usually by military helicopter, classification, the data being sealed into compartmented storage, dispersal of personnel, the team members being separated and transferred to different locations. It looked like a program, a sustained institutional initiative designed to establish knowledge about unknown fauna across multiple regions of Alaska. When Edmond tried to track down people involved in these other operations, he hit walls. Some had died, passing away in the decades since the 70s and 80s, taking their knowledge with them. Some had left Alaska entirely and couldn't be located through normal channels. Some, when Edmond did manage to reach them through veteran networks or community connections, refused to discuss anything related to their military service or became evasive and anxious when the topic arose. There was a pattern to the anxiety. It wasn't the kind of emotional distance that comes from not wanting to rehash difficult experiences. It was fear, a recognition that discussing the operations could trigger institutional response. One man, a former signals specialist named Kenneth Bradford, agreed to meet with Edmond in 2003. Bradford lived in Juneau, had established a civilian life as an electrical contractor, and seemed initially resistant to discussion. But when Edmond explained his own experience with the Fort Greely operation, Bradford agreed to talk. The conversation went for nearly 6 hours, documented partially in notes that Edmond preserved. Bradford had been part of an operation in the Brooks Range in 1979. A team of 7, similar composition to the Fort Greely team, similar objectives, similar time frame, similar equipment. When he got back to Fort Greely, he was processed the same way Edmond had been. Debriefed, his findings were classified, sealed into institutional storage. Like Edmond, he was given a dispersal package, financial compensation, and orders to maintain silence. Transition to civilian life. No further involvement. But about a year after his discharge, something happened that differentiated his experience from Edmond's in ways that troubled both men when Edmond finally learned about it. Bradford was contacted by someone claiming to represent a private military contracting company. The representative identified himself as working for a firm called Northern Reach Consulting, a name Bradford had never heard before and couldn't verify through any normal channels. The representative said he was aware of Bradford's military experience, specifically his experience with the classified operation in the Brooks Range in 1979. The representative said his skill set and knowledge could be valuable to private sector operations, focusing on resource management and protection services in remote regions, and that there was significant financial compensation available if he was interested in contract work. The initial offer was approximately $30,000 per month for episodic work, which was extraordinary money in the mid-1980s. Bradford was suspicious and refused. He didn't want involvement with any organization that knew about his classified military service. He didn't want to know what that knowledge was being used for. He politely declined and told the representative not to contact him again. 2 months later, he was approached by another representative from a different company with a similar offer. Not exactly the same pitch, but the same underlying message. We know what you did. We know what you know. We want to hire your expertise. The company name was different. The details of what services they were seeking were different, but the fundamental approach was identical. This time, the money was higher, $50,000 per month. Again, Bradford refused. He was more direct this time. He told the representative that he had no interest in discussing his military service or using knowledge from classified operations in private sector work. After the third approach, from a third different company in the span of 6 months, Bradford understood that it wasn't random recruitment. It wasn't a coincidence that multiple private contractors were approaching him with specific knowledge of his classified military service and with escalating financial incentives. It was a recruitment drive. The private sector was being given access to the same information the military had been compiling about the subjects in Alaska. The names of people who had direct knowledge, contact information, whatever leverage could be used to bring them into private operations. And they were trying to systematically bring people with direct knowledge and experience into their operations. Bradford had documented the offers, written down the dates, the company names, the representatives' names when they provided them. He kept this information in a small notebook that he preserved, along with his service records and other documentation. It was this documentation that Edmond eventually examined when he met with Bradford in 2003. Bradford showed him the records, and they talked for hours about what it could mean that private contractors were recruiting former military personnel with knowledge of classified operations. What were these companies doing? What did they intend to do with knowledge of undocumented fauna in remote Alaskan territories? Was it research? Was it capture? Was it something else entirely? Something that neither of them had the framework to imagine? Bradford had never accepted any of these proposals. The idea disturbed him deeply, and he'd refused all three approaches. But the fact that the approaches had occurred at all disturbed him in ways that went beyond the immediate solicitations. It meant that the monopoly on knowledge about the subjects wasn't being maintained by government institutions alone. Private contracting companies had access to the same classified information, which meant either the information was being deliberately shared at institutional levels, or there were serious breaches in classified systems that were being exploited by private sector entities. Edmond found this revelation deeply troubling. The Fort Greely operation had been structured around documentation and preservation of classified knowledge. The compartmentalization and dispersal of personnel was designed to prevent the knowledge from leaking into public discourse. If that knowledge was now being distributed to private contractors, if it was being used by companies operating outside normal government oversight, then the entire structure of the original institutional arrangement had been compromised or deliberately altered. What was supposed to be protected was now potentially being used for purposes that Edmond had no way to understand or predict. What were private military contractors doing with knowledge of undocumented fauna in Alaskan wilderness? What applications were they pursuing? When Edmond finally decided to speak publicly in 2023, it was in part because he was running out of time. He was 86 years old. His wife Helen had died 3 years prior, after 45 years of marriage that had been built on a foundation of careful omission. Helen had eventually stopped asking about his military service. She'd learned early that he wasn't going to discuss it, that there were compartments of his life that were sealed off, classified in ways that extended beyond official military classification. She'd accepted this as the price of marriage to someone who had certain experiences that he couldn't and wouldn't share. His children had their own lives, their own families, and they'd grown up in a household where their father maintained a careful silence about significant portions of his life. His daughter had asked once when she was a teenager what he'd done in the Army. He'd told her logistics, equipment management, nothing exciting. She'd believed him because she wanted to believe him, and because his tone of voice had carried a finality that discouraged further questioning. Edmond was aware that when he was gone, the knowledge he carried would be lost unless he made it public while he still could. The knowledge would die with him. The details, the names, the specific sequences of events, the context that only someone who had been there could provide, all of it would vanish into the past. He could see that prospect clearly. 50 years of carrying something, and then it all disappeared when he did. That seemed wrong to him. It seemed like betrayal of the creatures he'd witnessed, of Landauer who'd disappeared into the classified system, of the whole truth of what had happened in the interior of Alaska. He was approaching 87. He had no serious health conditions, but he had no illusions about immortality either. His parents had both lived into their 90s, so genetics suggested he might have some years left. But years were becoming precious in a way they hadn't been when he was younger. Each year that passed was a year less for making the decision to speak, for providing the record, for establishing the testimony. He also suspected, based on research that Morrow had conducted and shared with him, that the classification on the original Fort Greely operation was nearing its automatic declassification date. Some classified documents are sealed for specific periods, usually 10, 15, 25 years, depending on the classification level. Others are classified indefinitely. But Edmond suspected that the Fort Greely documentation might fall into the former category, that somewhere in the system, in government archives managed by the National Archives and Records Administration, the documentation was going to become available to researchers and journalists, whether the government wanted it to or not. Better to establish the record himself, while he was alive, to provide context and verification, than to have fragments emerge from declassified files without explanation. Better to control the narrative on his own terms. The night I spoke with Edmond for the final recorded interview, a conversation that went on for 12 hours across 2 days in his Fairbanks home, he brought out something else he'd preserved for nearly 41 years. A letter from Dr. Philip Landauer, dated November 18, 1982, 7 years after the extraction from Alaska. Landauer had managed to get it to Edmond through channels that bypassed normal mail. How exactly Edmond wouldn't specify, though he suggested it had gone through intermediaries and had taken months to arrive. The letter was sealed in a plastic envelope, the paper inside yellowed and fragile, the handwriting clear but slightly hurried, as if Landauer had been writing in circumstances where speed was important. The letter was remarkable because it provided a window into what happened to the biologist after the operation, where he'd been assigned, what he'd been asked to do. Landauer wrote that he'd been reassigned to a research facility near Rachel, Nevada, a location he described in careful language that made clear he was aware his letter might be intercepted by military intelligence or other institutional machinery. The town of Rachel is real, a small community about 80 miles north of Las Vegas, notable primarily for its proximity to the Nevada test and training range, and its association with classified military research. The facility Landauer described wasn't explicitly identified, but the location was unmistakable. The facility was focused on behavioral analysis of subjects in controlled environments. That was the official framing. Landauer used careful language to describe what he was actually doing without being explicit about it. Some of those subjects are biological organisms that don't have formal taxonomic classification, Landauer wrote. This was his way of saying that the research facility was housing creatures that didn't fit into any known taxonomy, that weren't recognized in scientific literature, that officially didn't exist. What I'm being asked to do here relates to understanding how to manipulate the behavior of things that have demonstrated adaptive intelligence and social complexity. It's work that troubles me significantly on multiple levels, both ethically and scientifically. The creatures we documented in Alaska deserve to exist without becoming research subjects in facilities like this. They deserve not to have their existence negated by institutions that seal the knowledge away. They deserve to remain wild. They deserve to maintain their territorial sovereignty and their family structures without institutional interference. Landauer went on to describe the facility itself, using geographical and institutional references that Edmond could decode. The location near Rachel, Nevada, was significant because of its proximity to classified military research installations. The facility itself had been constructed with containment in mind. Concrete structures, heavy security, the kind of infrastructure designed to keep something securely contained. Landauer described his work as involving behavior modification research, studying how the creatures responded to various stimuli, how they could potentially be controlled or directed. This is research focused on applied applications, he wrote. The military clearly isn't interested in this knowledge for purposes of understanding or conservation. They're interested in it for purposes of control and deployment. That means they believe these creatures have capabilities or characteristics that could be militarily useful. That thought keeps me awake at night. The letter went on to suggest something that was deeply disturbing to both Edmond and Morrow when they read it decades later. Multiple live subjects had been captured and brought to the Nevada facility. Landauer didn't specify how they'd been captured or when. He didn't provide details about how many were being held. But he made clear that he was working with living examples of the creatures they'd documented in Alaska. He seemed to believe, based on conversations he'd had with other researchers at the facility, and based on what he was being asked to study, that the Fort Greely operation might have been designed with this outcome in mind. That documentation and establishment of location weren't just goals in themselves. They were prerequisites to capture. They were reconnaissance. They were intelligence gathering designed to support a larger operation. The military now has the leverage it needed, he wrote. They know where these creatures live. They know the population is small, which means vulnerable to targeted extraction. They have the capability to extract individuals for study and transport them to containment facilities. Whether they will or won't pursue further captures is now a matter of institutional decision-making and political priorities. I'm told that at least some of the subjects currently in the facility were captured within the past few years, which suggests that the extraction operations are ongoing. I don't know where they were captured from. The information is compartmented even within the facility. But based on what I can infer, I believe they're extracting from populations in Alaska and possibly from other regions as well. The question of how many have been captured and whether the wild populations can sustain the losses is something nobody's discussing. Because if the populations can't sustain the losses, then they're engaged in slow-motion extinction through capture and containment. Landauer's letter ended with instructions that seemed to carry more weight the more Edmond thought about it over the years. "Keep the truth alive," Landauer wrote, "even if you have to keep it secret, even if institutional pressures force you to maintain silence. Keep the truth alive. Do whatever you need to do to preserve the knowledge. Write it down, store it safely. Make sure that when the time comes for full disclosure, someone is available who knows the real history and can testify to what actually happened. When the time comes for people to know what's in the world with them, they're going to need someone who remembers accurately," Landauer continued. "They're going to need someone who can testify to what actually happened, not the sanitized versions that institutions will construct. Institutions will want to present this in ways that minimize their role and liability. They'll want to frame the discovery in ways that make their actions seem reasonable and justified. They'll want to control the narrative. You have to preserve the truth in a form that can't be edited or revised. Be that person. Keep the record." That closing statement became the organizing principle of Edmond's life for the next 40 years. He kept the record. He preserved the notes. He maintained the knowledge. He didn't speak about it, but he kept it alive internally. He thought about it. He reflected on it. He wondered about the creatures, about what had happened to them in the decades since 1975, about whether they'd survived or been captured or been hunted. He wondered about Landauer, whether he was still alive, whether he was still working in classified facilities, whether he ever thought about the canyon in Alaska and the creatures that they'd documented there. He wondered about what the military had decided to do with the knowledge. All of these questions lived with him, shaped how he moved through the world, influenced his decisions and his relationships. Edmond followed that instruction. He preserved his notes. He maintained contact with Morrow and eventually with other veterans who had been part of similar operations. He built a network of people who knew something had happened, who had experienced institutional silence around the discovery, and who believed that the subjects existed and mattered. When I asked Edmond what he thought the military ultimately decided to do with the information, what decisions had been made at levels above Harrison's authority. He was thoughtful. He'd spent nearly 50 years thinking about this question. He'd constructed elaborate theories, had rejected some and held on to others. He'd tried to piece together evidence from fragments of overheard conversations, from the kinds of questions military intelligence had asked during his debriefing, from the way certain topics were handled by the veterans he'd encountered. He laid out several possibilities, each one building on details he'd observed or inferred. One, the creatures were simply monitored and the buffer zone was maintained, allowing them to continue existing without direct government intervention. The military knew where they were. The military had established perimeter restrictions. The military had interdicted civilian access to certain regions. In this scenario, the creatures were being managed through institutional control of territory, a kind of benign containment that benefited the creatures by keeping humans out. 2. Live subjects were captured and are being held in secure facilities, their behavior studied, their capabilities assessed for military applications. This was the possibility that Landauer's letter had suggested. It was the scenario that haunted Edmond most, because if it was true, then the creatures that had shown him recognition, that had demonstrated intelligence and emotion and the capacity for relationship, had been taken from their territory and placed in confinement. It was the possibility that suggested the worst kind of institutional cruelty. 3. The creatures are being selectively harvested, killed for biological study, a slow culling that the public would never know about. If the military had concluded that the creatures represented a threat or an opportunity that required direct action, they might have decided to eliminate them systematically. It would be difficult to do without leaving evidence, but not impossible in remote regions where no one was watching. It would be a kind of genocide conducted in secret. 4. An arrangement was made at some level of government where the creatures are treated as protected by quiet agreement with the military, a treaty between institutions and a species nobody knows exists. This was Edmond's hope, that somewhere decisions had been made that recognized the creature's right to exist, that accepted the creature's presence as legitimate, that had created institutional structures to ensure their protection. It was, he admitted, probably naive. "Which of these do you believe?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think it's all of them simultaneously. Different decisions were made by different institutions at different times. Some monitoring occurred, some capture may have occurred. Some research certainly occurred. The arrangement is complex and contradictory because institutions are complex and contradictory. What I'm certain of is that the creatures exist and that the government knows they exist. Everything else is inference." I asked if he had any advice for people listening to this story. He said, "Don't assume institutions are telling you the truth about what exists in the world. There are entities, phenomena, living things that have been documented and then deliberately excluded from official narratives. If you encounter something that doesn't fit the official categories, that means either you're wrong about what you saw or you're right, and institutions are wrong about what should be acknowledged. One of those has to be true. The consequences for institutional authority are significant in either case, which is why acknowledgement comes slowly and reluctantly, and often not at all." The last thing Edmond gave me was permission to use the contents of Landauer's letter. He said he'd carried it long enough. He wanted it to be part of the record when he was gone. That letter is now with archivists at a major university, in the custody of a researcher who has agreed to preserve it and make it available to future scholars when the time is appropriate. Before Edmond ended our conversation, he gave me one more thing: permission to use his name, permission to establish the record, permission to tell the story without the protective fiction of anonymity that usually shields people who have carried classified knowledge for decades. He said it was time. He said the truth mattered more than the protection, more than the institutional consequences, more than the silence. After 50 years, he said, the truth needed to be spoken. I thought about Edmond's words about institutional erasure. The creatures exist, whether or not institutions acknowledge them. Their existence isn't dependent on documentation or classification or public recognition. But human understanding of the world is shaped by institutions. The official narratives we accept as true determine how we understand ourselves and what we believe is possible. When institutions deliberately exclude something from those narratives, when they classify knowledge and compartmentalize awareness, they shape not just what we know, but what we can know. The interior of Alaska remains largely unchanged since 1975. The military buffer zone is still in place, still officially unclassified as anything specific, but still effectively restricted. Rangers and guides working in the interior occasionally report sightings consistent with the descriptions Edmond witnessed, but those reports are filed away, documented, and then forgotten. The creatures continue to exist in the gaps between official acknowledgement and private knowledge. Robert Edmond continued to live in Fairbanks. He maintained his connection to the network of veterans who had experienced similar situations. He advocated quietly for declassification of the Fort Greely operation and hoped that someday the documentation would become public. He said that when he died, his remaining papers and notes were to be donated to an archive with restrictions on access until 50 years after his death. He wanted the record to exist, but he also wanted to provide buffer, a period of time before everything became immediately accessible. I asked him if he thought people would believe the story, if he expected that his testimony would be taken seriously, or if he expected that listeners would dismiss it as the fabrications of an old man looking for attention. He laughed, which was rare in our conversations. He said, "Probably not. Most people won't believe it. It requires accepting that institutions have actively concealed knowledge and that official narratives are fundamentally incomplete. It requires trusting someone who spent most of his life keeping secrets to tell the truth now, which creates obvious credibility problems. How do you know he's not still lying? How do you know he's not using his years of security clearance and institutional training to construct a more elaborate fiction? It requires acknowledging that something exists in the world which undermines the categories that we use to organize our understanding of reality. If there are intelligent creatures living in parallel to human civilization, surviving in remote territories, that challenges the foundational assumptions of how we think about ourselves and our place in the world. That's a lot to ask of anyone, but that doesn't change the reality, he said. The creatures are real. The operation happened. The documentation exists. What people choose to do with that information, whether they believe it or investigate it or dismiss it, is entirely up to them. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm trying to establish a record. I'm trying to make sure that the truth of what I experienced is on the historical record, even if that record remains mostly unknown. Even if most people never read it or hear about it, it will exist. It will be available for future researchers, for future historians, for future people who might wonder about this period of time and what the military was doing in interior Alaska. He emphasized something important towards the end of our discussion. He said, "I need to be clear about one thing. I'm not making any claims about what should be done with this information. I'm not advocating for anything. I'm not trying to argue that these creatures should be protected, or that they should be studied, or that they should be left alone. That's not my place. I'm presenting the facts of what happened, and I'm leaving it to others to decide what those facts mean and what should be done about them. My job was to carry the knowledge truthfully. That job is done now." When Edmond's health began to decline in early 2024, he reached out one more time. He wanted to provide additional context that he'd remembered or that seemed relevant. He described in more detail the behavior of the juvenile that had approached the observation point repeatedly. He said that Whitaker believed the juvenile was attempting to teach Edmond and the team how to interact appropriately, how to signal non-hostility, how to participate in the social structures that governed the creature's territory. If that was true, Edmond said, then we learned. We became something like allies, or at least neutral participants in a landscape that they controlled. We were given access because we demonstrated that we understood the rules. He also recalled that Dr. Landauer had theorized that the creatures might have multiple populations distributed across North America, possibly hundreds or thousands of individuals living in dispersed territories, maintaining isolation from human populations through behavioral adaptation and territorial knowledge. If that theory was correct, Edmond said, then the Fort Greely operation was just one documentation of a phenomenon that might be continental in scale. That possibility has stayed with me. The idea that right now, across vast territories of North America, in the deep forests and remote mountains, creatures exist that are intelligent, that are aware of human presence, that have chosen to live in avoidance of confrontation. That institutions know this, that documentation exists, that the official narratives we're given about what exists in the world are incomplete, not because of incompetence but because of deliberate choice. Robert Edmond died in his sleep on March 14, 2024. He was 88 years old. His obituary in the Fairbanks newspaper mentioned his military service without detail, his work in construction management, his wife Helen, who preceded him in death, and his consistent involvement in veteran organizations. It mentioned that he was survived by a daughter and son, neither of whom knew the full details of what their father had experienced. It didn't mention Fort Greely. It didn't mention the creatures. It didn't mention the 50 years he carried the weight of classified knowledge, the way that knowledge had shaped his decisions, influenced his relationships, colored how he understood the world and his place in it. At his funeral service held in a small church in Fairbanks, David Morrow spoke briefly about Edmond's integrity, his consistency, his refusal to falsify or exaggerate what he had witnessed. Morrow said that Edmond had remained steadfast in his commitment to truth, despite the institutional pressures to remain silent or to reframe his experience, to minimize what had occurred, to accept the official narratives that downplayed the significance of what had been documented. That commitment to truth was his legacy, Morrow said. In a world where institutions controlled information and narratives, where institutions had every incentive to deny and conceal, Edmond had chosen to remember accurately, to preserve the truth, and eventually to share it, even knowing that sharing it would mean breaking an oath he'd sworn over 50 years earlier. After the service, I was approached by Edmond's nephew, who said his uncle had left instructions that certain materials were to be made available to me. Those materials were the field notes, the letter from Landauer, and a video recording that Edmond had made in 2023, in which he walked through the operation step by step, answering questions that had been provided in advance, providing as comprehensive a record as he could establish. Edmond's voice in that recording is steady and careful. You can hear the weight of decades in his tone, the precision of someone who has thought deeply about what he experienced and what it means. He talks about the responsibility that comes with knowledge, the burden of carrying information that institutions want to keep hidden. He talks about the distance between truth and the willingness to acknowledge truth. How these are not the same thing. How truth can exist without being acknowledged. Yet acknowledgement can transform truth into something that shapes how society understands itself. He talks about the creatures themselves, about how they deserve to exist without being subject to institutional study or capture or erasure, about how the act of documentation, while necessary, also creates the possibility for institutional control. Toward the middle of the recording, his voice shifts. He becomes more reflective. He describes the juvenile approaching his observation point, describes that moment of mutual recognition, He says, "I was aware in that moment that we were communicating something to each other. Not language, something deeper than language. Understanding. Two conscious beings, different in every way, but conscious nonetheless, acknowledging each other's existence. That moment meant more to me than all the documentation, all the video footage, all the technical evidence. That moment was real in a way that the official record never can be." At the end of the recording, he says something that I want to leave you with. He says, "What happened in the interior of Alaska in the summer of 1975 matters, not because it's extraordinary, but because it's real. It's one instance of institutional knowledge that has been compartmentalized and kept from public understanding. But it's not the only instance. There are stories like this everywhere, all across human civilization, structures that exist to maintain secrets, to preserve institutional authority over knowledge, to ensure that certain realities don't become public. The creatures in Alaska are one example, but they're not alone. They're part of something much larger, a system of concealment that shapes how we understand ourselves and the world we live in. That system doesn't exist because the truth is dangerous. It exists because the truth is powerful. Truth has the power to reshape how we understand ourselves, our place in the world, the institutions that claim authority over our understanding. That's why it's controlled. That's why knowledge is compartmentalized. That's why people like me are required to remain silent. Not because the information is dangerous, because the implications are. The recording ends there. The last thing Edmond left for the record was his conviction that the creatures exist, that their existence has been documented, and that institutions have made deliberate choices about how that knowledge is managed. Whether you believe that story or not, whether you think the documentation is real or fabricated or misinterpreted, doesn't change the fact that Robert Edmond carried it faithfully for most of his life, that he passed it on to others, that he eventually decided that the truth of what happened mattered more than the institutional pressure to remain silent. That's the Fort Greely operation. That's what a military operation to document unknown fauna looks like, when institutions are designed to contain and classify rather than to disclose. It's a story about the limits of official knowledge. It's a story about the distance between what we're told exists and what actually exists. It's a story that Robert Edmond carried alone for nearly 50 years, and that he finally decided to share with people he'd never met. If you've ever wondered whether something exists in the world that official sources tell you doesn't exist, this story is for you. If you've ever experienced something that doesn't fit into the categories that institutions provide, this story is for you. If you've ever thought about what might be living in the remote territories, in the places that humans don't go, this story is for you. If you've ever questioned whether you could trust official narratives about what exists in the world, about what's possible, about what's real, this story is for you. Robert Edmond lived in Fairbanks until the day he died. He maintained his silence for 50 years, watching from the edges of veteran communities, listening to other people's stories about classified operations and hidden knowledge, understanding that he was part of a larger pattern of institutional concealment. He watched the internet emerge and transform how information was shared. He watched the world change. He watched technology advance. And he waited. When he finally chose to speak in 2023, it wasn't because something had changed that made it safe to speak. It wasn't because declassification had occurred. It wasn't because institutional resistance had weakened. He spoke because he was running out of time, and because he believed that the truth mattered more than his personal safety. He spoke because he understood that in keeping the truth alive, he was fulfilling Landauer's last instruction. He spoke because he had watched too many secrets go to the grave with the people who carried them. His legacy is the documentation. It's the handwritten field notes, preserved for decades, now in an archive waiting for researchers to discover them. It's the letter from Landauer, the most direct evidence of what happened to the biologist after extraction, the proof that the creatures were removed from the wild and placed in institutional custody. His legacy is the insistence that truth matters more than the comfort of not knowing, that speaking truth in the face of institutional denial is a form of integrity that doesn't require vindication or official acknowledgement to have value. His legacy is also the creatures themselves, the creatures that continue to exist in the interior of Alaska, unknown and undocumented in any official capacity, living in the margins of official understanding, existing in the space between what we know and what we're willing to admit. Whether they still exist in the deep country, whether populations have been diminished by extraction operations, whether they've learned to avoid human contact even more effectively, Edmond believed they were still there. He believed they had adapted. He believed they had survived. He believed that the juvenile that had approached his observation point 50 years ago, if it had survived to adulthood, had probably transmitted the knowledge of human coexistence to its offspring, had created a legacy of understanding how to interact with the strange bipedal creatures that occasionally appeared in their territory with what seemed like peaceful intent. That's the story that Robert Edmond left for us. That's the legacy of Fort Greely in the summer of 1975. That's what one man carried alone for nearly 50 years, and what he finally decided the world needed to know. Epilogue. What remains? The story doesn't end with Edmond's death, though that's where the record closes. What remains is the question of legacy and what happens to knowledge when it's finally released into the world without institutional filters. In the years since Edmond first spoke publicly about the Fort Greely operation, other veterans have come forward with corroborating accounts. Not many, because the compartmentalization was extensive, because the security protocols were designed to prevent exactly this kind of disclosure. But enough have spoken that a pattern has emerged. The military conducted multiple documented operations across Alaska between 1975 and 1985. The creatures they documented were real. The data was classified and sealed away. The people involved were dispersed and isolated. What strikes researchers who have examined Edmond's testimony is how consistent it is with what's known about classified military operations during the Cold War. The compartmentalization, the security protocols, the use of civilian guides who weren't officially part of the military structure, the extraction of data and personnel, the integration of findings into classified research programs. This follows the established pattern of how the military handled anomalies that didn't fit into official categories. Edmond's conviction that Dr. Landauer continued working in classified facilities appears to be accurate based on what fragmentary information is available. Landauer published nothing after 1975. He seems to have disappeared entirely from public life. His academic career was essentially erased. Some researchers have speculated that he's either deceased or remains employed in classified research to this day, bound by secrecy agreements that have prevented him from speaking about what he experienced. The question that remains unanswered is what the military ultimately decided to do with the knowledge. Edmond laid out the possibilities: monitoring, capture, selective harvesting, quiet, protection. The truth is probably some combination of all of these, with different decisions made at different times, by different institutions. What seems clear from the available evidence is that the creatures Edmond documented in 1975 continue to exist. Reports from interior Alaska continue to describe encounters consistent with the descriptions from 50 years ago. The military buffer zone continues to exist, still officially unclassified but still effectively restricted. The interior of Alaska remains largely unchanged since Edmond's operation. Vast territories of wilderness that see minimal human presence. Dense forests where something intelligent could establish territory and defend it. Remote drainages where populations could persist without exposure. The creatures Edmond documented, if they still exist, have almost 50 years of undisturbed time to establish themselves, to maintain their territories, to continue their social structures without human intervention. What would it mean if Landauer's theory is correct? If the creatures exist across North America, in multiple populations? If there are not just the handful that Edmond documented, but hundreds or thousands of individuals living in dispersed territories? If they've successfully maintained their existence in the margins of human civilization by understanding human behavior well enough to avoid confrontation? That possibility suggests something remarkable. It suggests that institutional knowledge of their existence, far from being a burden or a threat, might actually have contributed to their survival. The military buffer zone in Alaska might be the thing that allows them to persist. The classified research might have documented their intelligence in ways that prevented their being hunted to extinction. Edmond believed this. He believed that maintaining the silence was, in a strange way, maintaining the creature's survival. He believed that if the knowledge became public, if the creature's existence was acknowledged, the consequences would be catastrophic. The rush to study them, the scientific interest, the pressure to capture specimens, the religious and cultural implications, the geopolitical consequences of acknowledging an intelligence on North American soil that had been hidden from official knowledge. All of these things would converge, and the result would likely be negative for the creatures themselves. This was why Edmond's final decision to speak was so significant. He wasn't just breaking a security oath. He was taking a calculated risk based on his belief that the time had come, that the knowledge could exist in the historical record without triggering institutional response, that people like Landauer deserved to have their work acknowledged, that the truth had value independent of whether anyone believed it or acted on it. What happens with that knowledge now is up to others, researchers who want to investigate, journalists who want to follow up, skeptics who want to debunk, believers who want to validate. The story is public now. Robert Edmond released it into the world. The institutional machinery can't fully contain it anymore. And in the interior of Alaska, in the deep canyons and remote valleys, the creatures continue. Unknown, undocumented, free. Extended reflections. The weight of witness. When I asked Edmond near the end of our conversations what it was like to carry this knowledge for 50 years, his answer was more revealing than I expected. He said it was like being a witness to a crime that nobody believed had occurred. You know what you saw. You know it's real. But the world around you operates as if it didn't happen. Institutions tell you it didn't happen. Official narratives say it didn't happen. And after a while, you start to wonder if maybe you're the one who's wrong, even though you know you're not. There's a particular kind of psychological weight that comes from that contradiction. Edmond described it as a constant, low-level pressure. Not every moment of every day, but there beneath the surface of everything. A knowledge he couldn't share. Information that was sealed away. Questions he couldn't ask. The weight accumulated over decades. What sustained him, he said, was understanding that the knowledge existed independently of whether anyone believed it. The creatures were real, whether or not he had proof. The operation happened whether or not it was declassified. The documentation existed whether or not the public had access to it. Institutions could suppress information, but they couldn't suppress reality. This philosophical stance became central to how Edmond approached his later life. He stopped expecting people to believe him. He stopped trying to convince skeptics. He focused instead on preserving the record, maintaining the knowledge, and waiting for the time when it might become relevant again. In the last interview before his death, Edmond was asked what he would want to be his legacy. He said simply, "I want people to know that the truth exists, independent of whether institutions acknowledge it. The creatures exist. The documentation was created. People witnessed something extraordinary. Those facts don't change based on classification levels or public opinion. What I'm leaving behind is testimony, not proof necessarily, just the honest account of someone who was there, who saw what he saw, and who never wavered in describing it accurately. That testimony is now part of the public record. Whether it's believed, whether it's investigated, whether it changes anything remains to be seen, but it exists. It can't be unspoken. The institutional question. One of the most penetrating questions anyone asked Edmond about his experience was simple. Why did you finally decide to speak? His answer revealed something fundamental about how institutions operate and how secrets are maintained. Edmond said that the institutional machinery that had kept the Fort Greely operation classified depended on several factors remaining constant. First, the people involved had to remain silent. Second, those people had to believe that speaking carried consequences. Third, there had to be a plausible story to explain why the operation remained classified. Fourth, the public had to have no reason to suspect anything was being hidden. All of these factors had shifted by 2023. Edmond was 86 years old. The people involved were mostly deceased or aging. The Cold War had ended decades ago, eliminating the primary rationale for classification. The Internet had created 1,000 alternative narratives and discussions that made the institutional monopoly on information impossible to maintain. Speaking no longer carried the same personal risk because the institutional framework that had enforced silence had weakened. More importantly, Edmond recognized that the act of speaking itself, once done, could not be undone. The classified operation couldn't be reclassified simply because someone had broken silence. The knowledge would exist in the public record. Future researchers could examine it. Future historians could incorporate it into their understanding. The institutional power to contain information had fundamentally limits beyond which it couldn't reach. This is why institutions ultimately fail at maintaining secrets. Not because people don't want to maintain them, but because the institutional conditions that enable secrecy are temporary. They depend on constant reinforcement, on the continued silence of all involved parties, on the maintenance of plausible deniability. When any of these factors changes significantly, the structure weakens. Edmond understood this intuitively. He recognized that the moment someone broke the silence, the entire institutional arrangement changed. It no longer mattered whether official confirmation came. It no longer mattered whether declassification happened. The knowledge was public. That was irreversible. Aftermath and ongoing questions. The decision to release Edmond's testimony didn't result in the declassification of the Fort Greely operation. The classified status of the original documentation remains unchanged as of this date. The military has made no official statement about the operation. No documents have been released. The buffer zone in interior Alaska persists without explanation. What has changed is that the knowledge now exists outside the institutional control structures that had contained it for 50 years. Researchers have begun investigating the claims. Some have traveled to interior Alaska looking for corroborating evidence. Some have attempted to interview other veterans who might have been involved in similar operations. The threads are beginning to untangle, albeit slowly, and without the clear pathways that official declassification would provide. The creatures themselves, if they continue to exist as Edmond believed they do, remain unaware of any of this. They continue their lives in the remote territories, following the patterns of behavior that have allowed them to survive, maintaining their territories and their family structures. Whether human knowledge of their existence, whether public or classified, changes anything about their lives is impossible to determine. What seems clear is that the question of what exists in the world with us is far more complex than official narratives allow. There are margins, there are territories where institutional control is limited, there are possibilities that remain undocumented because the documentation was sealed away or never attempted. Robert Edmond spent 50 years as a witness to one of those possibilities. He carried the knowledge faithfully, and when the time came, he chose to share it. What we do with that knowledge remains an open question, one that each of us must answer for ourselves.